So my book, Farthest Field, is a history of India's experience in World War II, told through the private story of a young family, which is my family, who got drawn into the war and lived through it. And I was surprised. I surprised myself, or rather, I should say that it was surprising for me to discover that I was writing this book, because I'm not a historian. I wasn't even much of an amateur historian until 3 years ago, which is when I discovered, which is when I first heard about the existence of this young man in my family, whose name is Bobby Mugaset. I'd never heard that name before. I only knew of him as a photograph, a black and white photograph that was in my grandmother's house. And after my grandmother died, and as that generation passed on, Bobby was on the verge of being completely forgotten. And our family had almost forgotten that he had ever existed. But what I learned about Bobby that day made me need to recover as much as I could about his life. And that was that in 1942, he was commissioned into the Indian Army at the peak of World War II, and also at the peak of India's freedom movement. And this was really startling for me, because A, I didn't know that the fellow had ever existed, and B, I didn't know that that this larger context had existed, that India had a role, let alone a very major role, in the Second World War. And I'm a journalist. I also pride myself on knowing a fair amount about the 20th century, about our 20th century history. And so this was especially kind of astonishing as I began to realize how much history there is there, the overlap between India and the Second World War. And so discovery sort of followed discovery, and it turned out that it wasn't just Bobby, but his two brothers-in-law, so all of the young men of that family in that generation who went off to war and to serve the British Empire at the point that their countrymen were fighting to be free from it, and they didn't always come back, and I had to find out why. And so that was the beginning of how it was through following them that I unfolded the kind of this hidden landscape of India's Second World War, and it took me to all sorts of places that I would never have expected. It starts in Calicut and spends a fair amount of time in Madras, where all these young men and young women are in college and spend their their civilian lives, and then once they are commissioned into the army, it takes them to all sorts of places that I'd never realized, let alone Indians. I never realized the World War played out there at all. Places like Iraq and Iran and Ethiopia, Burma, and India's northeast, which is the climax of the war and one of the most fascinating places where I realized, which I realized had been transformed by World War II. So the fact that these three young men in my family had even considered joining the army was a sign of a huge transformation that was underway in the army, that was occurring under pressure of the war, which was that for the first time in the history of the Raj, large numbers of middle-class men were being admitted as officers in the Indian army, in significant numbers, because the army was growing so fast. The army grew more than 10 times its size in the years of the war, and it was impossible to find just the personnel for the officer corps from Britain. And so for the first time, large numbers of Indian young men with college degrees, like these guys, Bobby and Manik and Gunny, were not just permitted but encouraged and sort of and browbeaten into signing up. For them, it must have been a fascinating and complicated decision, because apart from the sort of political dilemma that I've been talking about before, it was such a racially fraught situation. Until now, the army had been a sort of a founding principle of the army of the Raj that it had white men in command, and brown men taking orders. And for the first time, these brown men were sort of infiltrating the hallowed mess halls of these regiments. And you hear lots of stories, very interesting stories about how that played out. It wasn't. They're usually subtle situations. It wasn't a story of like unrestricted racism, because the Indians knew how to put up a good show, and they played by the rules, and they won on the terms of the colonial army, and people like Timmaya and Karyappa and so on rose quickly through the ranks despite lots of adversity. But it was a very racially fraught time, and it was only because of the absolute necessity of having Indians in those positions, and because of the encouragement of certain people like the chief of army staff, Claude Auchinleck, the commander-in-chief, Claude Auchinleck, that Indians were made more comfortable in the officer ranks in the Indian Army during those war years. But that experience is very important to capture, because in the same way that the army of the Raj was one that was designed and formulated and came to exist because of what happened in 1857, the modern Indian army, including the army we have today, is one that was designed and came to exist because of World War II. And it was because Indians were admitted into it and drawn into it that was a major factor for why independence came about so quickly after the war ended. So the fact that the story of India's Second World War has faded from our common memory and from our sort of national history doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in records. And in fact, there are luckily many records that exist and are incredibly rich and sort of fertile in terms of what they can tell us and how they can recreate that period and that adventure. So that's the official history, but my book sort of melds the larger history of the country with the more intimate history of these 4 or 5 young people. And so I also had to draw on other sources that were less that were more difficult to access and also less authoritative to reconstruct their private lives. So in a sense, it's a melding of history and memory, and I think it does ask the question of where one ends and the other one begins. So apart from going to the archives and pulling out the war diaries of the individual units in which these young men served, or going to the Imperial War Museum and listening to recordings of army officers talking about their operations, I also traveled around the country and interviewed Indian veterans of the Second World War wherever I could. These were mainly men in their early or mid 90s, men actually nearing the end of their lives. That was fairly obvious. But men with the most startling and rich and vibrant stories, and it was always a terrific experience to go back and talk to them about their youth and the adventures they had, which are incomparable, of course, to the early lives of my generation. So it was by meeting veterans that I was able to better reconstruct the military experience and the sort of the dilemmas that faced military men who were serving in the Indian Army during World War II. But I also traveled around to meet older people who had known my protagonists in person, also of that generation, in the late hours of their lives, and I met many of them just in time to sort of recover fragments of stories and sort of testimonials about who these 5 guys were, and who Bobby in particular was, because he's in a special kind of enigma. and to put it all together in the form of this book. And one of the poignant things about this process and about the timing of it, all of which is really kind of essential to the nature of the book, is that many of the people who I relied on for these stories, for these memories, weren't still with us by the time the book came out. One of the interviews that I did with one of the veterans is one that I'll never forget, because he was a particularly kind of graceful and handsome old man who had been in the Indian Air Force, still alive, who had actually joined up in the ranks, which was very rare for Parsi. And he invited me over because he had known one of my characters in person, and for me this was treasure. And I went over there, visited him in Bombay, and once I met him in person, he couldn't remember what the story was, and sort of put his hands on his eyes and sort of rested his head, and it was an incredibly moving moment because it was a reminder in a sense, and made it very clear that this was no ordinary interview. This was an interview with someone who's lived a very long life, in which I was asking him to draw on a memory from so long ago, and so it really sort of brought out the arc of time that we were trying to, the gulf that we were trying to cross, talking to someone who was maybe 95 years old about someone he had known, and who had died when he was 25 years old, 70 years ago, you know. That gulf is almost a theme in the book, because I couldn't separate what I was writing and the kind of story I was telling, and even the history that I was constructing I couldn't separate that from the fact that that time had changed these memories, and it had sort of polished this history in a particular way, and it had allowed so much to fall apart. So it was always very apparent that, in a sense, this was a selection, this was a sifting of those actual experiences into what could still be remembered, what could still be told 70 years later. But luckily, what could still be remembered and what could still be told was so terrific, so gripping for me, and I found so full of romance and excitement and bravery, and obviously large serving of tragedy and heartbreak, that it was more than I'd even counted on when I set off. I was very lucky with these characters because, and this is just by my good fortune, the routes that they take, there's 3 young men who join up, one of them in the Air Force, one of them is an army doctor, and one of them is a sapper or a combat engineer, so he's a sapper officer in the Bengal sappers. And by my good luck, the way they moved in their deployments and the way their units were deployed through the war years created a kind of perfect outline of how the Indian Army moved, and what its actions were, and what its sort of engagements were through the Second World War. And so Bobby's unit, Bobby's my main protagonist, begins in East Africa, in Eritrea and Ethiopia, and moves to North Africa, moves to the Middle East, moves back to India, and then to this sort of climactic battle on India's eastern border, moving east to challenge the Japanese at Kohima, which has a perfect sort of thematic balance for my purpose. But it also meant that his story led me through my research, as did the story of these other veterans. So the first veteran that I met, whose name was Colonel Beliappa, when he first told me, yeah, so my first overseas posting was to Iraq, I thought, what, to Iraq? What were you doing in Iraq during the Second World War? And so it was by looking at the war through the eyes of these men that I discovered these places that I might not have otherwise paid attention to. For instance, the fact that in 1941, the Indian army essentially invaded Iraq, took occupation of the entire country, and then invaded Iran and set up an occupation of Iran as well, and then maintained an occupation of this territory, which is thrice the size of France, until the end of the war. I mean, this is, in my own lifetime, there have been so many invasions of Iraq that I thought that I was aware of the full history of that business, but it turns out I wasn't, and that there's a huge precedent for it set by Indians. The other two, as with most, as with many Indian servicemen during the Second World War, the stories all eventually arc towards Burma, because that ended up being such an enormous sort of campaign for the British Empire. It was the longest lasting theatre of war for Britain in World War II. It was the largest. It was the largest retreat that the British suffered in 1942, and it was the 14th Army was the largest British army, the largest army of the empire as well, and that was majority Indians. So, as with Bobby, a lot of these fates end up sort of arcing over towards India's eastern border and towards Burma. But the other two, the pilot and the doctor, introduced me to a separate part of the world that I would never have associated with the Second World War, and that was the northeast frontier provinces, which are obviously now in Pakistan. My mistake, the northwestern frontier provinces, which are now part of Pakistan. It's almost like a fantasy to imagine this now, but at one point the Indian government actually feared, apparently realistically, that the fascist armies might break through Stalingrad, might break through El Alamein in Egypt, and make such uninterrupted progress as they had that far, that they would reach the border to India. Imagine German Panzer tanks in the northwestern frontier coming through the Khyber Pass. It sounds preposterous, but in fact they actually laid down tank obstacles in the Khyber Pass at the start of the war. So, of course, it would later turn out that the Indian government had entirely prepared for the enemy to arrive from the wrong direction, because the eventual invasion of India, of mainland India, would come from the east. But the significance of what the Indian army and what the armed forces, including this young fledgling air force, were doing in the northwest frontier provinces, they were taking over colonial roles from the British forces so that those could be sent elsewhere to do other kinds of fighting. That significance is something I would never have thought of. I would never have thought of dwelling on that part, but it brings that part of the world, but it brings so much to light, and brings so much to light also about the fundamental dilemma that I think Indians had been facing during the war, which is figuring out which side they should be fighting on and what they should be fighting for. Farthest field is a phrase that occurs right at the prologue of the book, and also right at the end in the final lines of the final chapter. It has a literal meaning which is fairly clear, and I hope it evokes the kind of very distant and remote battlefields and deployments and the kind of obscure roles and fates of many Indian soldiers and officers during World War II. But there's also a further field and an obscure fate which has to do with the place that we've sent them to in terms of how we remember them or how we fail to remember them. So it's a phrase that I don't expect anyone to really understand the full implications of until they've read the book, or at least read the preface. But what it genuinely refers to, the reason that it's the title, is that it's a gesture at a kind of forgetting, at a destination that isn't a geographical destination, but a place right at the horizon of memory, a place into which people cross when, not just when they're dead, but when even the memory of them is about to disappear, when even everyone who knows them is about to go. And the reason this is important is that that generation is now passing away. And therefore, all of the people who knew the young men who died in the Second World War are leaving us. And that means the memory of those young men, unless it's sort of written down or conveyed forward or just told to their families, those stories, unless they're carried forward, are going to be crossing that line into the farthest field, into the place from which we can't bring back stories or memories, bring back people who we've forgotten. And bringing back these three men was from that farthest field before they crossed, was essentially what I was trying to do with this book.